I'm very happy to be here to talk to you today. Can you hear me? Yes. Good. First of all, I want to thank the sponsors of this program and also Bill for enabling me to talk to you. I want to share with you my experience in part as an accidental survivor of the Holocaust.
All right, Julius, you want to make yourself comfortable?
Bill will ask me questions, and then I will answer.
Okay. Julius, you described your early years as a wonderful life. Tell us about your family and you in your life before you moved to Palestine.
I was born in Danzig. Danzig was a city-state that was established by the League of Nations, and it had a very liberal constitution. It was semi-independent. Its foreign policy and army were Polish. Poland was defending it, but it really was German. And I lived there. My father was a very successful lumber merchant, and he also, through this lumber business, he met my met my mother, and her father had a match factory in Białystok and big forest near Vilna, which now is the capital of Lithuania, and that whole area where the forests were, it's now Belarus, which is another country.
Julius, your father had served in the Russian army, is that right?
My father was a soldier in the Tsarist army. He was born in Kiev, which is now the capital of the Ukraine, and he fought on the Austrian front. The Russian army was very poorly equipped, and he lost his toes on one leg because of the cold weather and inadequate clothing.
Why did he move from Russia to Poland?
Well, he escaped. There was a lot of uncertainty in the Ukraine at that time. And remember, the Soviets were taking it over. It was a very bad time. So he escaped to Poland, and Poland was fighting for its independence against Russia. He got a fictitious birth certificate from a fictitious village that made him 10 years older. This way he didn't have to serve in the Polish army. And he escaped to Danzig. As I said, many Jewish intellectuals went to Danzig. In fact, there were 2 ambassadors in Washington from Israel. One of them was my childhood playmate, and I forget his name. But anyhow.
Julius, in 1935, when you were 6, your family then moved to Palestine. Tell us why your family moved to Palestine, and tell us about your years in Tel Aviv at that time.
Yeah, I'll sit down. I have a very bad leg. I'm almost 90 years old. And what was your question?
Your family moved from Poland to Palestine when you were 6. Tell us about the move, why they moved to Palestine, and what it was like when you moved there.
He was a great Zionist, and he always wanted to live in Palestine. And so in 1935, we went, my mother, father, and little sister, and the German governess, who was Catholic, who was willing to go with us. It's very interesting. She, I really see her as my altar mother, and she taught me a lot of Catholic catechism that I used to say at night before I went to sleep. And she, unfortunately, she went back with us to Poland. I'll come to that story. In 38. And during the war, she was killed in the bombings in Berlin. So that's...
When you moved to Tel Aviv, you started school there. What was school like for you then in those years?
Well, when we got to Tel Aviv, it was a very nice city of about 250,000 people. And for example, it was right on the Mediterranean Sea. Excuse me. It was on the sea, and even if you were in the first grade, it was extremely safe. So children could walk to the beach. I used to go to the beach when I was in first grade and take a bath in the ocean, in the Mediterranean, and then walk home. And the burglaries were unknown. People wouldn't lock their houses. It certainly changed today, but in those days it was very nice. But when I enrolled in first grade, I didn't know any Hebrew. It was a Hebrew school, and the teacher was telling the kids, she was reading them Robinson Crusoe. So fortunately, she spoke German. So I would ask her to translate for me the story. So she would. And within 3 months, I learned Hebrew. When you're a child, it's easy to learn a language.
In 1938, you'd been in Tel Aviv for 3 years, but in 1938, in the summer...
I was very happy living in Tel Aviv. The German governors essentially took care of me. My parents traveled a lot. And I was very happy with my friends and school. And to go to Poland, it was a terrible idea. You must project yourself. I see we have a lot of students here. You must project yourself when you were 10 years old. And that's when I was forced to go to Poland. My mother wanted to visit her family, and my father still had a business in the port city of Gdańsk, which is near Danzig, so he wanted to sell it. So that's why we went in 38.
And you went...
Obviously, it was the clouds of war were there.
And when you went, it was intended to be just a short stay, but it didn't work out that way.
Just for the summer.
Just for the summer. Why did you not come back at the end of summer?
My father had difficulty selling it, and my mother forgot about going back. She had such a good time at her mother's. My mother, when we moved to Palestine in 35, she was only 31 years old. And to live in Palestine, where in Danzig she had servants, in Tel Aviv she had to do everything by herself.
So she was enjoying being back in Poland, and your father was not able to sell the business.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we came back to Warsaw, and I had to enroll in a Polish public school. And I went 1 year to that school, and I had to learn Polish. Now you must imagine, especially the kids in this group, if you suppose you had to move to, let's say, to Mexico. You had to learn Spanish, you had a different, maybe a different religion, a different way of life. This is basically what I confronted in Poland. And the most, all the Poles were Catholic, but so the first, there was no separation of state and religion like we have in the United States. And so in the first hour, it was devoted to catechism. So those who were not Polish kids had to leave the classroom and wait in the hallway. And those of us who were Jewish, this was the first time I really learned about discrimination. So this year passed, and I learned Polish.
Mm-hmm. Julius, in that time, you went there in the summer of '38. You stayed more than a year. Now we're into the middle of 1939. You mentioned that there was threats of war.
Yeah.
Were your parents worried about war, to your knowledge, and was that?
Well, as a child, I was not.
You don't know, okay.
I was just angry that we didn't go back.
Yeah.
And when that summer of '39, I spent at my grandmother's little place in the woods. And she taught me how to collect mushrooms so not to be poisoned, and berries. And that was very enjoyable. And I played Tarzan in the forest. I had a little knife, and it was very enjoyable summer, I must say. Unfortunately, we still didn't go back, so well, I must say, I keep forgetting that summer we went to that map isn't here anymore, but we went to a resort that was very close to East Germany and very close to Białystok, because Białystok was close to the German border.
So September 1st, 1939,
Yeah.
Germany invades.
I was in this summer resort, and September 1st, the Germans attacked Poland, and I remember the Germans took up planes, were diving down. They had a special noisemaker, and they would machine gun the people.
Do you remember that personally?
Yes, we were able to escape to Białystok through some friends who had a car, and they took us. And my father was in Warsaw, so my mother went to Warsaw. It's interesting, Warsaw survived for 2 weeks being besieged by the Germans, but before it collapsed. But so my mother was very lucky. She found my father, and they came out on one of the last trains back to Białystok. My father said, "We cannot stay here." So he found, now remember this was 1939, a long time ago. And he found my late grandfather's coachman. And that coachman came in the morning, it must have been the 3rd of September or so. He came with a buggy, just like the pioneers who went west, that had straw in it and a canvas top, and we climbed into the buggy, and we went into the Polish forests.
And tell us about that trip when you spent 2 weeks trying to go through the fields and
I
forests.
spent 2 weeks in the forest.
Yeah.
What saved us as we were traveling, it wasn't very far. We wanted to go to Vilna. My mother thought that her mother would be there. She had a house there also. And the 2 weeks, you can ask, what did you eat for a week, the first week? We ate apples. We ate apples because Poland had a lot of apples, and there was nobody to pick them because the soldiers were the farmers were in the army. Mm-hmm. And the same thing, there was nobody to harvest the wheat, which was very tall. So when the roads were filled with refugees who also were escaping east. And every time the Stukas appeared, we would jump into the wheat field, and the tall wheat protected us.
And the Stukas were the German dive bombers, right?
The dive bombers, yes. Yeah. And we were lucky to come back to the cart, and around it there were pieces of humans, and animals, and blood all over, and smoke from cars, etc. It was terrible. One of the questions that often I'm asked is, was I afraid? Well, I think as a 10-year-old, you can only be afraid for a few minutes. Mm-hmm. You can be afraid when the Stuka was diving and machine gunning the people. I was afraid, mm-hmm. as I remember. But long-term fear is an anxiety that usually visits people, but not children. Mm-hmm.
So after 2 weeks of going through that...
The second week, we found farms that had a lot of eggs. Mm-hmm. So my father bought the eggs, but we had to eat raw eggs.
So after 2 weeks, you made it to Moldova.
Only dogs can eat them.
But you were forced to eat them. You were forced to eat them. But you made it to Molodechno after 2 weeks. What happened once you got to Molodechno?
Oh, when we got to Molodechno, which was a railroad junction, the coachman said, I have to go back to Białystok. So he left us on the platform, and we were standing there, and we didn't know what to do, but we heard this rumble, and then pretty soon it became louder, and those tanks appeared, and we were convinced that they were German, but they had the Soviet star, the red star. So we knew that nobody's going to kill us instantaneously. And this Russian young officer came on the platform, and he liked my little sister, and he would give her chocolate bars. And then he asked my father where we are going, and he said, we want to go to Vilna. And the officer said, are you Jewish? And my father said, yes. And the officer said, I'm Jewish also. So he put us on a military train. Molodechno is not very far from Vilna, maybe 100 miles. And we came to Vilna, which is a rather large city. And my grandmother wasn't there. So we went to one of her farms in this village called Miori that was not far from Vilna. And we spent there about 2 weeks. And my achievement as a 10-year-old was I learned how to ride a cow. And I must tell you, it's very difficult to ride a cow. Anyhow, we came back to Vilna, and I had to go to 5th grade, and I had to learn Lithuanian, because Lithuania occupied Vilna. And it's a very strange language. It's a very difficult language. It's not similar to Polish at all. And also I had to learn Lithuanian history, which I still remember some of it. But in the meantime, we lived in a terrible place, in the old Jewish ghetto. My parents managed to rent a room for my family, and at night the rats would come out through the rafters, and the Soviets who occupied it. I don't want to go into the history because it's very complicated, but I went to this Jewish school. It was a public school called Tarbut, that because there were so many Jews in Poland, there was a network of schools. It's very interesting. And it was a school where all the subjects except the language of the country, which was Lithuanian, and the history, were taught in Hebrew. And I liked the students very much. My father had basically no money, and I would go after school with one of the students to his home. His name was Srolovich, and his father was a lawyer, so he was rather wealthy, and he had a radio that he could listen to the BBC. And I had to go back to the ghetto and tell my father the summary of what the news were.
You, as you said, the conditions where you were living were really tough conditions. You had rats in there. You told me that food was very meager, and it was also terrifically cold. You were very cold. It was a cold winter.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Vilna is very far north, and it's very cold in the winter. And I didn't have any warm clothes, so my mother used to rub my legs with animal fat, because otherwise I would freeze. I had to walk half an hour to the school, and eventually, if we had money, we could fly to Sweden, and from Sweden we could go any place, because Sweden was a neutral country. And actually, my father found an old friend of his in the capital of Lithuania, which was Kaunas at that time. And this man gave my father about $5,000. It was a lot of money in those years. It's certainly like 50,000 today. And so my father was able to get, for our family, transit visas to the Soviet Union. There were only 300 Jews who came this way on a transit visa to the Soviet Union. What I remember and might interest you, when we came to Moscow by train, It was the winter of 1940, before the attack of the Germans on the Soviets. And they put us up in a hotel.
Julius, before you go there, I just want to have you share one thing that you told me. Because it was so cold in Vilna, and you wore short pants to go to school, tell us what your mother would do to keep you warm.
Oh, I said, yeah, she would put animal fat.
She would coat you in animal fat on your legs to keep you warm, like goose fat, right? Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting, the Soviets, how they attracted children especially. They showed movies outdoors, free, and we loved it.
So as you were starting to say, Julius, there were only 300 transit visas issued. Your family got 4 of them. So you set out on a train trip through the Soviet Union to make your way to Palestine. So
overnight in Kiev. My father had half of his family. They were still in Kiev, but he didn't want to see them because the Soviets would arrest him. You couldn't have, in the Soviet Union, you couldn't have any contact with foreigners. And, so in Moscow, we were at the Savoy Hotel, which had glorious days in the Tsarist time. But this was like a Kafka story. There was a chandelier in the dining room that was covered with cobwebs. There were satin curtains that were torn, and there were waiters that had old tuxedos on. And in the dining room, we were the only guests. And we saw the menu, it was a book, but the waiter said, no, we don't have any of these. We just have stew.
he gives you the menu with lots of items, but he says, but we only have stew.
Yeah. So after 3 days, we continued. One of the waiters said to my father, there won't be any food on the road because on the train they don't have food. So my father and this waiter made a barter trade. My father gave him 2 silk ties, and the waiter gave us a cooked goose, which was rather good.
But that was to be your food on the train, right?
Yeah, there was none.
Yeah.
In Europe, it's very common on holidays to eat goose instead of turkey. Yeah.
So he gave him 2 silk ties for the goose to take with you on the trip. So then you take off from Moscow. Tell us about the trip from Moscow. Where did you go?
Well, we went actually from Moscow by train. We wanted to go to Odessa, which was on the Black Sea. It was some of the native tribes, one of them, they camped on the railroads and they built a fire so the train had to stop. So fortunately we had that goose. When we came to Odessa, they confiscated fur coats. My little sister had a little gold ring. They ripped it off her finger. They took everything away. And my grandfather had a big stamp collection. And I ripped the stamps out before we left and put them in a big box. So they confiscated it. But my father pleaded with the official, and the official said, tell your son he can stick his hand in that box without looking. Whatever he can pull out with his hand, he can take. So we went on a Soviet ship. It's overnight, basically, to Constantinople, Istanbul, and then after overnight there, which I don't remember much, we went on a train to the Syrian border. It's rather a long trip.
And you'd shared with me that besides,
Picked up a lot of bed bugs
I was going to ask you about that. A lot of bed bugs on the train. Yeah.
because we had to go third class. And from Syria, Lebanon, we went to Palestine back. And of course, because my father he lost everything basically in the war. We lived in a small apartment, and
You're back in Tel Aviv now.
Yeah.
You're almost 12.
And the war continued,
Right.
because the Germans and Italians would bomb. They tried to bomb Haifa, the refineries in the north of the country, and if they missed the refinery, there's some other problem, they would drop their bombs on Tel Aviv because they couldn't go back to their base. It would be too heavy. They didn't have enough gasoline. So every night almost for a while, we all had to go down to the shelter. After a while, I refused to go, and I stayed in bed. I said, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die, whatever it meant. And as Bill described, I joined the Haganah, the Defense Forces, when I was 15. When I was 17, I went to officers' training course. And the most eventful thing that happened to me there was a candidate, a girl from Vilna school who survived the ghetto uprising in Vilna. There was an uprising. They were all killed. But she managed to escape. And when I saw her, it was one of the most emotional moments in my life. I gave her a big hug. And I still remember it. I described it all in my book in much greater detail. But I look forward to your questions.
Julius, before we get to that, a few more questions from me, if you don't mind. So you're 12 years old. You're back in Tel Aviv. You started to tell us about the resistance movement. Palestine was under British control at that time.
We were a British colony.
You were a British colony. So
yes.
there were several resistance movements going on.
The Arabs wanted their independence. The Jews wanted theirs. And basically, the Jewish community was run by the communal settlements, the kibbutzim. And they were mostly leftist. Today, Israel is very right-wing, but in those days, Ben-Gurion, who was the leader of the country, they were labor people.
Julius, as you said to us, of course, the war's still going on, and these Jewish resistance groups were making plans that they might have to fight the Germans if Rommel was to come into Palestine.
Because Rommel, remember, he was already in Egypt, and we thought the German forces would eventually move to Palestine too. So in the underground, we made plans for the people to escape to the mountains. Mm-hmm. But fortunately, it didn't come to it.
So, but you became active in the Haganah at age 15. What did that mean to join the Haganah? What did you do? What did that mean for you?
Okay, when I was 15,
yeah.
Once a week, I had to go to a remote school, and in that school, under the floor, They had an artificial cover. They would pick out handguns, various armaments that we learned how to use. And also, as a 15-year-old, I was involved in, we would plaster the walls with illegal pamphlets that would say to the British that they will have to leave. It was somewhat dangerous because if you were caught by the CID, the Criminal Investigation Division of the British Police, they would beat you on the kidneys with a metal rod that was covered with rubber. This would leave no outside injury, but it would destroy your kidneys.
And you're 15 years old and you're taking these risks.
Yeah. When I was 16 or so, from an older class, a girl was killed by a tank. And then when I was in the army, first of all, as Bill described, I came to Berkeley by myself. I basically, you might say, escaped from my mother.
Before you go there, you mentioned earlier the kibbutzim, and you had gone, before you came to the United States, you'd gone to work at one of the kibbutzes, right? And you told me an incident about being out in the fields, I think with tomatoes, and you got news about the end of the war in the Pacific.
Yeah, it was customary in Palestine that in the summers, the students, high school students, would go to a communal settlement to help out with the farm work. And I spent several summers in different communal settlements. This one, we had to remove stones from fields that were never used. And this person came out, said the war is over with Japan because of the atomic bomb. We didn't know, I didn't know what the atomic bomb was. But when it said it killed 100,000 people, whatever it was scary.
What was, with the war over, and now some Jews were able to survive in Europe and they're coming to Palestine. What do you remember from that time, right after the war? What was it like in Tel Aviv? Or in Israel more generally?
Well, there was no Israel yet. It was
Palestine.
Remember, in 48, it was created. Basically, Tel Aviv was the same, except it became a much bigger city. And when I was 18, after one semester in Berkeley, I went back.
Before you tell us that, how did you make the decision to go from Palestine to Berkeley, California, to go to school?
Well, there were several generations of students who went to school in California, in Berkeley and Davis. And they told me, the climate is good, easy to find a job, and university was very inexpensive. To give an idea how much I paid at the university, $60 was for the hospital and so on, and then $600 per semester. And there were 2 semesters a year, and you could take as many units as you wanted. That was more or less the norm to the States. I know that today it's crazy.
How did your parents feel about you going to California, to the United States, much less to California on the other side of the United States?
As I said, the climate was good. You could find a job. Education was inexpensive. It was really paradise.
So it's paradise, you're in the United States, but you weren't there long. You went back.
I went back and then I came back. I was in the Army almost 2 years. In 1950, 2 weeks after I got out, I was on a ship to go back to Berkeley.
I want you to share with us some story you told me when you left Berkeley the first time to go back for the War of Independence. You went back, and when you got to...
Bill, I wanted to leave some time.
We do. We have time. I got one more question for you. So tell us about when you got to New York, there was a dinner or a party thrown for you before you're going back to Palestine to fight in the War of Independence. Tell us about that.
Oh, there were these people in the Bronx who invited me to a party. And I went, and there were all kinds of Jewish veterans from World War II, and they wanted to give me all kinds of weapons to take back.
So this party, all these people bring out their weapons for you
Yes.
to take with you.
It was very moving, but I could only take one.
So you served in the Army for 2 more years. You fought in
Yeah.
the War of Independence. And
Yes.
what was that like for you?
But the Army was crazy because each one had different uniforms, and as you know, they beat the Arab armies, which was a miracle. And there were several thousand survivors of the Holocaust who arrived, and many of them were drafted immediately without any training to fight in the War of Independence. The British, in the meantime, remember, they gave up. So they May 15th, I think, when the British gave up the mandate, and the 7 Arab armies attacked, and somehow the small Jewish army succeeded in defending itself. I had good friends who were killed in that war, and I often think about them.
Once Israel had its independence, you returned to Berkeley and completed your education and began your new career. There's many other things I'd like to ask you, but let's turn to our audience and see if they have questions for you. So we'll do that. So
Thank you very much.
we have a microphone in each aisle. We're going to ask that you wait till the microphone is handed to you if you have a question. Please make your question as brief as you can. I'll repeat the question just to be sure that we hear it properly up here before Julius responds to it. So it's a little hard for us to see because of the glare of the light. So help us out, let us know if we've got anybody raising a hand. I've got one right here in the front row, and I've got one right in the middle here. So you're going to come down to the front, and I think there's one back up here too. So yes, you're right here. And I'll repeat the question, yes.
You learned so many languages and then came to America. When did you learn English?
You learned so many languages, then came to the United States and learned. When did you learn English?
Well, I knew a little bit from school, but in Berkeley, I understood what the professor would say, but in some courses, I couldn't write my notes in English, so I wrote them in Hebrew. Yeah.
It's pretty hard to keep track of all the languages that he knew, right? Okay, I think, do we have one back here? Or we had one right here, right there in the middle. There we go. You go ahead, please. Thank you, Emily.
My question is, what was the hardest experience you had in your childhood get into that such an ordeal.
The question is, for you in your childhood, what do you think was the hardest ordeal for you?
The hardest thing was to give up my friends, to go overseas again. And some of those friends I never gained back. And that was very difficult.
And this is a lot of this was when you left Palestine to return to Poland, right? Yeah. Yep. Okay. All right. Thank you. We have one here and then one back there. Okay. Yes, sir.
I know it's a different place now, but have you returned to Tel Aviv recently at all?
Have you returned to Tel Aviv or Israel recently?
Oh, no, not in the last 10 years, because I'm opposed to this government. But 10 years ago, I organized a symposium in my field, and that was very nice.
All right. Thank you.
But the country changed a lot.
All right. We got a question back here, a little farther back, I think. One here, and I want to we're not going to forget you. I promise. I promise. Okay.
Yeah, that light is disturbing.
It is. Got a question here, young man. Okay.
When you said you were in the army, were you in like anything else other than the army?
Can you say that one more time for me?
When he was saying he was like in the army or something.
Oh, it was in the army?
Was he in anything else, like other branch of the military?
What was it like for you in the army? Is that the question? Yeah. What was it like for you to be in the army? Young man's asking you this question.
But it was a very informal army, and I worked part of the time. I was transferred to the medical corps, and I assisted in dermatology, syphilology, and gonorrhea.
Okay. All right. Now, for sure.
So I'm curious, when and how did you learn about the systematic murder of millions of Jews, and how did that make you feel?
When did you learn about the Nazis' systematic murder of more than 6 million Jews? And what do you remember about reacting to?
We learned about it during the war in Palestine in the early 40s.
Mm-hmm. Do you know how many family members you lost during the Holocaust?
There were 6 million people lost. When I lecture in Massachusetts, I tell the kids, usually high school, I said, just imagine you get up in the morning and all the people in Massachusetts are dead. Because that's about 6 million in Massachusetts and 6 million where? Yeah. But also there were many gypsies, Poles, and transgender people who were killed.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. A few more. There's one back here in the back. I see 2 back there. Okay.
There are a large number of 14 and 15-year-olds in the audience today. What message would you like them to take away from your life story?
Great question. There's a lot of 14 and 15-year-olds in this audience. There's a lot of 14 and 15-year-olds in this audience. What message would you like those youngsters to take back with them?
Well, first of all, you shouldn't forget that there was a Holocaust, and Holocaust also today in Darfur. You must remember in Rwanda and Kenya, Somalia. Holocaust is a tilt in the human system. If you think about it, the Germans were the most educated people in Europe, and yet they were able to do this, or carry out this awful thing, where they declared that some people are below people. They are worse than domestic animals.
Okay, thank you, Julius. Okay, there was one other one. Oh, there's one other one back there.
Had you ever actually visited or been near a concentration camp?
The question is, have you visited any concentration camps? In fact, you were just telling me about one that you were at.
Yeah, I visited the one where the inmates rebelled and 300 were able to escape to the forest, but they were betrayed by the native people. So only 30 or so survived. And I met this woman, very elegant woman, older woman, at the Holocaust Museum, and she said, I stabbed a Nazi to death because she was in that camp, and that's what she did.
I have one more question for you, Julius, before we end. When we finish, you're going to go sign copies of your book, your memoir.
I want to say something.
And yes, I wanted to ask you what it meant for you to write your memoir. And secondly, it covers your first 21 years. Why did you stop at age 21? Or, I mean...
I lost 2 children about 40 years ago, and I didn't want to write about it.
Okay. What has it meant to you to have written the memoir?
Well, I'm glad I did, because for grandchildren, it's very important that they should know something about their grandfather.
Okay.
And also, I want to say about the Holocaust, you should never forget, and I think that the fact that you are here should help in this, not to forget. Not to forget, because the people who lived through it, like myself, are very old, and there are very few left.
Thank you, Julius. I'd like to thank all of you for being with us today.
Thank you.